11 Japanese fighters circle above. One American Corsair bleeds fuel and altitude over the Pacific. No speed, no backup. Every rule says climb and run. He does the opposite, dives straight for the ocean. 30 seconds later, the hunters are scattered, and nothing about air combat will ever be the same. 30 seconds earlier, survival still looked impossible. The Corsair shuddered as fuel mist streaked past the canopy, the engine coughing like a wounded animal. Altitude was bleeding away. Speed was gone. The Pacific waited below, cold, flat, and patient. Above him, 11 Japanese Zeros tightened their circle, disciplined and deadly veterans who had killed men just like him before breakfast. Every manual ever written had an answer for this moment. Climb if you can, dive away if you must. Regain altitude, regain control, but manuals assume choice. Over Rabaul in early 1944, Marine pilots rarely had one. The sky here punished hesitation. The air smelled of burned oil and salt. Radios crackled with broken warnings, bandits high. Brake left, then went silent as aircraft vanished in fire or water. Most fights were over in seconds. You either followed doctrine perfectly or you died trying. Inside this Corsair sat a pilot the squadron called the Farmer. Not loud, not reckless, no swagger. Just steady hands on the stick and a lifetime of flying low where mistakes were fatal. As the Zeros rolled into their dive, sunlight flashing off their wings, he made a decision no one expected. He didn't climb. He pushed forward and aimed straight at the sea. The Pacific War was not fought in heroic duels or clean victories. It was fought in margins of fuel altitude and seconds pilots never seemed to have. At 12,000 feet, the cockpit of an F-4U Corsair felt less like a weapon and more like a punishment. The airframe shook under the constant thunder of 18 cylinders driving a massive propeller. The control stick never rested, vibrating in the pilot's hands, as if reminding him that the aircraft tolerated mistakes only once. Below, the Pacific Ocean stretched outward without end, flat and indifferent. It swallowed wreckage whole, leaving no smoke columns, no graves, no witnesses. Men vanished there every week, sometimes entire flights. The ocean did not care about courage or training. It only waited. This was Marine Fighter Squadron 5, MF-124, operating from Torquemada Airstrip on Bougainville, a muddy gash carved into jungle and heat. On paper, their mission was simple: escort bombers deep into Japanese-held territory and bring them home. In reality, it was arithmetic attrition. Every sortie consumed fuel machines and men faster than replacements could arrive. New pilots showed up weekly, young and undertrained, stepping into cockpits still warm from the last man who hadn't returned. The Japanese understood this math perfectly. Zeros outnumbered Marine fighters 3-1 in most engagements. They climbed faster, turned tighter, and were flown by veterans hardened over China, the Philippines, and years of continuous combat. They waited above the Marines, placed the sun at their backs, then dove straight through the formations at closing speeds exceeding 500 miles an hour. It was efficient, brutal, and terrifying. American doctrine was clear, refined through blood and loss. Never turn with a zero, maintain altitude, use speed, dive away, survive. But doctrine assumed choice. Over Rabaul, escorts couldn't simply run. Bombers depended on them. When Zeros came screaming down from above, the Marines absorbed the first attack and hoped to survive long enough to break contact. Most did not. What pilots remembered wasn't what they saw, it was what they heard. The scream of diving fighters, the hammering crack of 20-millimeter cannon ripping through aluminum skin. And sometimes the worst sound of all silence, when an engine quit and a Corsair began its long, helpless fall toward the sea. Into that sky, the farmer kept flying. The men of VMF 124 did not expect survival to wear his face. They called him the farmer, half joke, half dismissal. He was tall and lean, sun-lined eyes, movements unhurried. He spoke slowly, as if each sentence needed to be checked for strength before it was released. In a squadron filled with young men trying to outrun fear with bravado, he stood out by doing neither. No loud stories, no reckless laughs, no hunger to prove anything. He had come from nowhere important. No academy pedigree, no engineering degree, no polished confidence shaped in classrooms and parade grounds. Just Kansas, wheat fields, dust storms, tractors breaking down miles from help, problems that had to be solved because there was no one else coming. Holloway had learned early what mistakes cost. Before a control stick, his hands remembered steering a tractor. Before combat, they remembered flying 10 feet above cornfields at dawn, engines, overloaded margins, non-existent. Crop dusting was not romantic flying. It was physics without mercy. Panic killed. Hesitation killed. You flew smooth, or you didn't fly long. In the ready room, some pilots thought he was cautious. Others thought he was slow. A few thought he didn't belong in fighters at all. He read obsessively after-action reports, maintenance notes, intelligence, summaries asking questions that irritated officers who preferred confidence to curiosity. He wasn't searching for glory. He was searching for answers. The winter of 1944 pressed down on every Marine in the Solomons. Heat-soaked flight suits before engines ever started. Humidity fogged goggles in seconds. The jungle below hid wrecked aircraft that would never be recovered. Above it all, the sky belonged to whoever seized altitude and aggression first. Most pilots adapted by becoming harder, faster, louder. Holloway adapted by thinking. He watched missions fail the same way over and over. Zeros from above, Corsairs bleeding speed trying to climb. Bombers exposed. Friends disappearing into water and fire. Doctrine explained what should work. Reality showed what didn't. And quietly, dangerously, the farmer began to wonder if survival lived somewhere no one was willing to fly. Holloway's questions had no place in a squadron bleeding men. VMF 124 didn't need theories. It needed pilots who followed orders and stayed alive long enough to finish a tour. The doctrine was clear, drilled into every Marine from the first day in fighters. Altitude was life. Speed was safety. Turning low was suicide. These rules weren't opinions. They were lessons paid for with wreckage scattered across the Pacific. But escort missions over Rabaul stripped those rules down to their weakest assumptions. Corsairs arrived at the edge of their range, fuel gauges already sliding toward empty. Bombers locked them into formation. When Japanese fighters appeared above them, Marines couldn't choose when to fight or when to disengage. They absorbed the first blow and reacted already behind the curve. Doctrine demanded altitude, but altitude belonged to the enemy. Losses mounted with mechanical certainty. In some weeks, VMF 124 buried pilots faster than replacements could learn their names. New men arrived fresh from stateside training, confident in theory and formation. Drills only to discover that nothing in their manuals explained what to do when the sky collapsed around them. They lasted 5 missions, sometimes less. Holloway watched this pattern repeat until it felt obscene. He sketched diagrams in notebooks no one asked to see mapping. Angles, closure rates, energy states. He noticed where fights always began and where they always ended. High above the bombers, then straight down. Always vertical, always fast, always final. What troubled him wasn't Japanese skill, it was geometry. Zeros dominated where Marines insisted on climbing. They owned the vertical space. But Holloway knew another environment one pilots feared more than enemy guns. Low altitude, thick air, no room for mistakes, no margin at all. It was where doctrine said never to go. He had lived there for years. In that space, speed behaved differently. Weight mattered. Ground effect existed. The earth or the ocean became a wall that compressed every attack angle. No room to dive, no clean escape, no comfortable place to set up a shot. When Holloway raised these thoughts aloud, they died quickly. His commander shut the discussion down with a sentence every Marine understood. Doctrine exists for a reason. Pilots who deviate die. Holloway nodded. He obeyed. But the thought remained. If survival no longer lived where doctrine promised it would, then maybe it lives somewhere everyone was too afraid to look. February 5th, 1944 arrived without ceremony. The briefing room at Torquemada smelled of mildew sweat and stale cigarette smoke. Maps of Rabaul harbor covered the walls, pinned and scarred from months of failed hopes. Red grease pencil marked shipping lanes, flak concentrations, known fighter bases. Everyone in the room understood what those markings meant. Long range, maximum fuel burn, no margin. The intelligence officer finished his briefing in a flat practice voice. 12 dive bombers, 6 Corsair escorts. Expect heavy opposition. Standard tactics apply. Maintain altitude. Protect the bombers. Disengage if overwhelmed. The words fell into the room like stones. No one asked how you disengage when the enemy chose the fight. No one asked how much fuel survival actually required. Holloway asked one question anyway. At what altitude would the bombers fly 14,000 feet inbound diving to 8 for the run? And if we're jumped from above, the answer came sharp and final. Follow doctrine, extend, regroup, re-engage if possible. Discussion closed. Outside Corsairs sat in their revetments, scarred and patched engines already warm in the rising heat. Holloway walked toward his aircraft tail number 57, feeling the familiar weight settle in his chest. Sergeant Mackenzie. His crew chief finished the last checks with grease-stained hands and a skeptical eye. Fuel topped off, guns loaded, oil pressure high but within limits. She'll fly. Holloway paused before climbing in. Then he asked for something unusual. Lower the gun sight, 2 degrees. Mackenzie frowned. That'll ruin your aim at normal range. Holloway nodded. I know. Engines roared to life across the strip. Propellers blurred, radios crackled with check-ins. The formation taxied, lifted off, and clawed its way into the gray morning sky, forming up around the bombers like nervous guards. As the coastlines slipped behind them and open ocean took over, Holloway settled into the rhythm of flight, conserving fuel, scanning the sky. He didn't know how the fight would come, only that when it did, doctrine would run out of answers. And when it did, he would have to choose where to fly next. 20 minutes from Rabaul, the sky gave its warning. Small flashes of light appeared high ahead, barely visible against the sun, too steady to be birds, too deliberate to be cloud. Holloway saw them first. His hand moved to the radio before his mind finished the thought. Bandits, 12 o'clock high. Angels, 20. The formation tightened instinctively. Bombers droned on, committed, now heavy and slow. Above them, the specks grew wings. Zeros climbing higher, patient, arranging the geometry of the kill. This was how it always began. Sun behind them. Altitude in hand, time on their side. Then they rolled inverted. 11 fighters screamed, downward engines howling, closing the distance at impossible speed. Tracers reached out first, bright and violent, followed by the blunt hammer of cannon fire. The air shattered. Captain Stafford's voice cut through the chaos. Break, break, and the sky exploded into motion. Holloway hauled the Corsair into a hard turn, G-forces crushing him into the seat. A Zero flashed past, so close he saw the pilot's goggles. He tried to track, but the Japanese fighter was already gone, climbing away untouched. Another came in from behind. Holloway snap-rolled and dove. The Zero stayed with him. Altitude vanished. 8,000 feet. 6, 4. His fuel gauge slid lower than he liked. Too low to climb. Too low to fight the way the book demanded. Radios filled with fragments, warnings, curses, screams, then dropped away into static. Somewhere in that chaos, his wingman was hit. Somewhere, someone was already falling. The ocean rushed up gray and hard, filling the canopy. Doctrine had one answer left. Extend. Run. Climb if you survive. Holloway looked at the water and then at the Zero still glued to his tail. He felt something old settle in, something learned long before uniforms and medals. At this altitude, hesitation was death. Panic was fatal. There was only motion, judgment, and consequence. He pushed the stick forward. The Corsair kept diving. 5,000, 3,000, 1,000. The Zero followed, then hesitated. Holloway didn't pull up. He leveled off 50 feet above the waves and flew straight into the place no fighter pilot was ever supposed to go. The Corsair shuddered as it hit ground effect, thick air grabbing the wings just feet above the ocean. Spray streaked the canopy. The engine's roar deepened every vibration, magnified every control input, suddenly final. At 50 feet, the sea was no longer scenery, it was terrain. A single lapse of judgment would turn it into concrete. Holloway eased the throttle back, letting speed bleed off until the aircraft settled into a narrow band of control, 200 miles an hour. Any faster, and he'd outrun his own reactions. Any slower, and the Corsair would sink. Behind him, the Zero screamed past, overshooting in a violent pull, up its pilot yanking back to avoid plowing into the water. For the first time, the hunter had misjudged the space. 2 more Zeros dove. Holloway didn't climb. He jinked hard left, then right, skimming wave tops, using the swells the way he once used rows of corn. He read the surface instinctively, the way light reflected, the way wind carved patterns into water. The Japanese pilots struggled to track him. At this height depth, perception collapsed. The horizon blurred. Targets disappeared against glare and spray. Cannon fire stitched the ocean behind him. Holloway pulled up sharply to 100 feet, then dropped back down, forcing the attackers to adjust their dives again and again. Each correction bled their energy. Each hesitation bought him seconds. The Corsair's weight, a liability at altitude, now worked in his favor, anchoring the aircraft against turbulence. Ground effect cushioned the wings, reducing drag, steadying his hands. The Zeros began to circle uncertain. American fighters didn't do this. They didn't stay low. They didn't deny the vertical fight. Holloway rolled inverted and reversed direction in a violent pull that made the airframe groan. Two attackers committed to intercepts that no longer existed and shot past each other, formations breaking apart. 1-0 lined up behind him, confident again. Holloway waited, counted, then chopped throttle and dropped 15 degrees of flap. The Corsair decelerated brutally. The Zero overshot its nose, flashing past the canopy. Holloway slammed the throttle forward, rolled inside the climbing arc, and for the first time all morning, the geometry belonged to him. He squeezed the trigger. 6.50 caliber machine guns tore the air apart. Tracers walked across the Zero's fuselage. Smoke erupted from its engine. The fighter rolled lost lift and slammed into the sea in a white explosion of spray 200 yards ahead. The remaining Zeros pulled up and away, circling higher, unwilling to follow him into that narrow, lethal space. Holloway stayed low, jinking randomly, refusing to offer a clean line. After minutes that felt like hours, the Japanese broke off. Alone, fuel nearly gone. Holloway turned south, still flying 50 feet above the waves. He didn't climb until friendly airspace lay ahead. When he finally did, the engine coughed, starved and tired, but kept running. He had survived by flying where mistakes couldn't be fixed and where no one else had dared to fight. The flight back to Torokina felt longer than the fight itself. Holloway stayed glued to the ocean, 50 feet above the water, every second measured against the fuel gauge, sliding toward empty. The Corsair's engine coughed once, then again a dry, mechanical warning. He ignored it. Climbing too soon would cost him everything. He flew low until the coastline appeared, then eased the nose up, coaxing altitude from an engine that had nothing left to give. The tower cleared him for immediate landing. Holloway brought the Corsair in fast and heavy, touched down hard and rolled to the far end of the strip. The engine died as he turned off the taxiway. Silence rushed in, sudden and absolute. For a moment, he just sat there, hands shaking, breathing the smell of hot oil and salt. Ground crews ran toward the aircraft. Sergeant Mackenzie reached him first, eyes scanning the wings streaked white with salt spray. "Sir," he said slowly, "how low were you flying?" Holloway unbuckled and stood on the wing legs unsteady. "Lower than I should have," he answered. Captain Stafford arrived minutes later, alive and furious. His aircraft was scarred with holes. His face was tight with anger and something worse, loss. One pilot hadn't returned. Holloway's wingman. Stafford demanded to know where Holloway had gone, why he'd vanished from the radio. Holloway didn't argue. He spoke plainly. He'd been bounced. He'd gone to the deck. He'd used ground effect and terrain masking. He'd splashed 1-0 and broken contact. Stafford stared at him as if he were hearing a confession to madness. "You flew at wavetop level?" he asked. "For how long?" "Approximately 18 minutes, sir." That should have ended the conversation. Violated doctrine, risked the aircraft. Case closed. But Stafford hesitated. "Confirm it," he said finally. "Gun camera. The film was developed within hours." Intelligence officers crowded into a dark room and watched in silence as grainy footage flickered to life. A Corsair impossibly low, water rushing beneath its wings, zeros overshooting pulling up in confusion. A clean firing solution, a fighter disappearing into the sea. Major Grayson ran the film again, and again. He didn't look at Holloway when he finally spoke. Explain exactly what you did. Holloway laid it out without drama. Low altitude compressed attack angles. Thick air stabilized the aircraft. Weight helped not hurt. Violent jinking broke tracking. The ocean confused depth perception and denied clean dives. He finished and waited. Grayson asked one question that mattered. Can this be taught? Holloway paused. Most pilots weren't trained to live that low. The margin was unforgiving. But the answer was simple. Yes, sir. With practice. That night, the ready room filled. Pilots who had watched friends die leaned in close, asking questions, demanding details. Holloway held his hand inches above a table. This close. The room went quiet. Doctrine hadn't saved them, but something else just might. The permission came quietly. No announcement, no applause. Just a single line in a classified memo authorizing experimental defensive training. In a war that punished deviation, it was an opening measured in inches. Holloway was assigned to instruct. They began before dawn when the ocean was flat and the light unforgiving. One Corsair at a time dropped to wave-top height while others watched from above, hearts in their throats. At 50 feet, the world changed. Air thickened. Controls went heavy. The horizon pressed close. Pilots who had mastered altitude suddenly felt naked. A moment's distraction meant death. Some climbed away shaking. Others came back drenched in sweat, eyes wide, understanding what it meant to live without margin. Holloway taught without speeches. He flew first. Low, smooth, precise. He showed them how to read the water, how swells revealed wind, how glare erased depth, how sudden motion broke a pursuer's aim. He taught violent jinks and sudden decelerations, how to deny a clean dive, how to turn the ocean into a wall that crushed attack geometry. He taught them to accept fear without letting it freeze their hands. Not everyone could do it. Some never would. But a few learned enough to survive the moment when doctrine failed. And in the Solomons, that moment came often. Word spread without a name attached. Pilots called it wave hopping, crop dusting, anything but what it was, a refusal to die the approved way. Intelligence reports shifted tone. Captured Japanese pilots spoke of Americans who would not climb, who vanished into glare and spray, who forced fights into a space that felt cursed. One described it as chasing a frightened bird, skimming the sea, impossible to judge, impossible to corner. The numbers moved slowly, then unmistakably. Loss rates dipped. Not because the enemy softened, because geometry changed. Because survival found a place no one had claimed. Holloway flew 16 more missions before his tour ended. He trained 6 pilots in the technique. 3 survived the war. He never claimed credit. When asked, he shrugged. He had simply flown where he knew how to fly. By summer, new aircraft arrived. Training improved. The Japanese bled experience they could not replace. History would credit those things, and rightly so. But buried in doctrine, stripped of story and name, a line. Endured low-altitude evasion, ground effect exploitation, terrain masking at sea level. Holloway went home. He wore a ribbon he didn't talk about. He taught others how to manage energy and fear. And when the war ended, he returned to Kansas, to wheat and corn, to flying low at dawn, where mistakes still couldn't be fixed. The idea lived on. The man faded. That more than anything proved it had worked. Holloway left the Pacific without ceremony, the way he had arrived. His citation used the language the military understood: exceptional airmanship, innovative tactics, devotion to duty. It did not mention how close he had flown to the water. It did not mention Kansas cornfields or crop dusters at dawn. It didn't need to. The paperwork was never the point. Back in the United States, he became an instructor, not a legend, not a rebel, just a quiet man at the front of a classroom explaining energy states, angles, and why altitude was not always salvation. Young pilots listened because he never spoke in absolutes. He spoke in consequences. He taught them that fear was information, that instinct could be trained, and that survival sometimes demanded choices manuals would never authorize. When the war ended, Holloway went home. He married. He bought 200 acres of wheat and corn outside Hays, Kansas, the same kind of land he had learned to read from the air as a boy. He flew crop dusters again, low and precise, teaching the next generation the same lessons. Frank Morrison had taught him, fly smooth, never panic, and understand the space you're in. He rarely spoke about combat. When pressed, he said only that he did what the situation required. He died quietly in 1983 in his sleep. His obituary was small. It mentioned military service. It mentioned farming. It did not mention Rabaul. But the idea never died. In Marine training manuals stripped of names and origin stories, the technique remained: low altitude evasion, ground effect exploitation, terrain masking at sea level. In flight schools, decades later, instructors still showed grainy gun camera footage of a Corsair skimming the ocean, breaking every rule, and surviving because of it. Students watched in silence, sensing that what they were seeing wasn't bravado, it was understanding. Most never learned the pilot's name. They didn't need to, because legacy doesn't always look like monuments or medals. Sometimes it looks like a line of doctrine written in cautious language, saving lives long after the man who inspired it has been forgotten. Holloway would have been fine with that. He had never wanted to be remembered, only to come home alive and help others do the same. Years later, long after the Pacific had swallowed its wreckage and the war had faded into textbooks, young pilots still sat in dark briefing rooms, watching the same grainy footage. A Corsair skimming the ocean, wings nearly touching spray. Japanese fighters overshooting, breaking apart, losing control of a fight they were supposed to own. The instructors never dramatized it. They didn't need to. The room always went quiet on its own. What the students were seeing wasn't a trick. It wasn't luck. It was a man understanding the space he was in better than the enemy chasing him. Understanding that rules are written for averages and wars are fought at the edges. Modern doctrine explained it cleanly. Ground effect reduces induced drag. Dense air improves control response. Terrain masking limits attack vectors. The language was clinical, stripped of fear and salt spray. But buried beneath the equations was the same truth Holloway had discovered over the Pacific: sometimes survival lives where instinct says, you'll die. The irony was complete. The safest place to fly in that moment had been the most dangerous place imaginable. 50 feet above the ocean. No margin, no recovery, no second chances. Only judgment, instinct, and motion. Holloway never stood on a stage. He never signed books or gave interviews. His name didn't end up on buildings or monuments. He didn't change the war by winning it. He changed it by refusing to lose the wrong way. By trusting experience forged far from battle, learned over quiet fields at dawn, where mistakes had always been fatal. War remembers victories. It forgets adaptations. But pilots remember what keeps them alive. Every time a young aviator learns to fly low, to use terrain to deny an enemy the fight, they want a piece of that decision over Rabaul survives. Every time someone chooses judgment over doctrine, understanding over obedience, the idea carries forward. Holloway's legacy was never meant to be loud. It was meant to be useful. A farmer who flew where angels feared to tread and proved that sometimes the only way out is down. In the end, the story does not close over the Pacific. It closes somewhere far quieter. A flat horizon, Kansas soil, wheat bending in the morning wind, an engine starting before sunrise. Holloway flew low again, just as he always had. 10 feet over fields instead of 50 over water. No enemy this time, no tracers. Just physics judgment and the knowledge that mistakes still carried consequences. To the men who trained after him, his tactics became lines in manuals, bullet points in lectures, footage spooled up on projectors. They learned the how without ever knowing the why. Few were told that the lesson had been written by a man who didn't look like a fighter pilot, who never sought permission to be extraordinary, and who never thought of himself as anything more than someone solving a problem that refused to be solved the accepted way. History prefers clean arcs. Heroes who rise battles that turn wars that end neatly. Holloway didn't fit that shape. He didn't win Rabaul. He didn't change the balance of the Pacific overnight. What he did was smaller and far more dangerous. He proved that survival sometimes demands disobedience. That experience earned far from war can matter more than theory forged inside it. That instinct, when disciplined by reality, can outperform doctrine written in safety. Most of the men who flew with him never knew the full story. They only knew that sometimes when the sky collapsed and every rule failed, there was another place to go, down, low, where fear sharpened instead of paralyzed, where the margin vanished and clarity took its place. Holloway never spoke about legacy. He didn't believe in it. He believed in coming home, in teaching others how to do the same, in leaving the world no louder than he had entered it. The Pacific kept its dead. The manuals kept his idea. And somewhere between those two truths lives the quiet understanding that war is survived not by those who follow every rule, but by those who know which ones no longer apply when everything is on the line. That was Holloway's ending, not a monument, not a name remembered, just pilots who lived because one farmer once flew where everyone else refused to look. Every war ends, but its questions don't. They linger in classrooms, in cockpits, in the split second before a pilot commits to a move that can't be taken back. Long after Rabaul faded into history, long after the Pacific reclaimed its wreckage, those questions still waited in the margins of doctrine, quiet, unresolved. What do you do when the rules stop working? Manuals are written in safe rooms, far from the moment when fuel is low, altitude is gone, and the enemy already owns the sky. They are built for averages, for order, for situations where choice still exists. Holloway had flown into a moment where choice had vanished. And instead of forcing the situation back into the shape doctrine demanded, he changed the space itself. He didn't defeat the enemy by climbing higher or flying faster. He defeated them by going somewhere they refused to follow. That lesson never belonged to one aircraft or one war. It belonged to the idea that survival is not obedience, it is understanding. Understanding physics, understanding fear, understanding when the environment itself can become a weapon. Holloway didn't invent courage, he redirected it. Modern pilots inherit that insight without ever hearing his name. They learn to read terrain, to exploit ground effect, to deny opponents the geometry they expect. They learn that sometimes the safest path is the most dangerous one, because danger sharpens judgment while comfort invites habit. Holloway's story endures not because it is dramatic, but because it is useful. It reminds those who face impossible situations that answers don't always come from above. Sometimes they come from experience no one thought mattered, from skills learned far from battle, from instincts forged where mistakes were never forgiven. The farmer didn't change history with a speech or a command. He changed it with a decision made 50 feet above the ocean when there was no time left to ask permission. That is where the story truly ends. Not with medals, not with memory, but with a quiet truth passed from one generation to the next. When the sky belongs to the enemy and every rule leads to death, survival may be waiting in the one place no one ever taught you to look.